with me. I'm here today to talk about Dyffryn Tywi, Hanes Tirwedd ein Bro, which is a landscape scale partnership project. The main phase of the project ran between February 2020 and January 2022, with some additional extra work continuing until this January. So these are our funders. We have also benefited from funding from the Welsh Government, so Welsh European Funding Office, and also additionally from the local Leader Fund as well. So the main phase of it was one of the Welsh Government's sustainable management schemes, and interestingly we were actually the only project with an overtly historic landscape element by design from the outset. As I mentioned, it's a partnership project, and we had a lot of network partners. You've probably realised that I've said the start date for the project, which was actually, we started in February 2020, which was literally just before the pandemic arrived. And interestingly, we sort of made a start on the project and then had to run a partnership project during a pandemic, which has been challenging at times, but luckily we've done a lot of work via Zoom, and because it's a landscape project, we've been out and doing lots of site work and visiting places. So these are the logos of all our network partners. A lot of the partner sites have sort of estates within the Tywi Valley. A lot of them are local tourism providers. So this, if I can get it to go forward. So this here is a map of the project area, and it shows the network partner sites. Can I get the clicker to work? Oh, is that actually showing up? No. Okay, so the red boundary is the boundary of our project area, and that's actually contiguous with the historic landscape character area of Dyffryn Tywi. Interestingly, it's been curtailed at either end, and I think basically the historic landscape character area runs all the way up to Llandyfri and all the way down to Llansteffan, but I think this area was chosen before I was involved with the project, and it's sort of bookended at either end with the two more major settlements of Llandelo and Carmarthen, and you know, not wanting to get tangled up in the sort of urban development of those, and keeping a bit of a rural focus to the project. It also made the project area slightly more manageable than it would have been had it not been sort of stopped at Carmarthen and Llandelo. So it's quite a large project area. So basically, it all started in the National Botanic Garden of Wales during the Regency Restoration Project. And if I can get the clicker to move it forward. Oh, that's too far. So this shows also the boundary of the registered landscapes of outstanding and special historic interest in Wales. The blue area is the boundary, the red area is the boundary of our project. It also shows registered historic parks and gardens and scheduled monuments as well. Now those are historic designations. You can see in the middle, no, I can't point. I can't point at that. So this patch down here is actually the site of the National Botanic Garden of Wales. And when I come to the next slide, you can see that not only is it a registered historic park and garden, but it's also got a National Nature Reserve on it. And when the Regency Restoration Project was going on, there was a lot of work done to manage that landscape for biodiversity, but at the same time be working with the historic landscape designations. It's a Cadw Grade 2 star listed as a result of the restoration project. It's now a Cadw Grade 2 star listed landscape park and garden. And so that designation was clearly important, but also so was the designation of National Nature Reserve. So from that project came the idea that, you know, we can work together, and sometimes when you think sort of the needs of different aspects of that are going to be conflicting, there are ways to sort of manage them so that they can be mutually beneficial. And so that's really where the idea for the project started. So a bit about our project aims. I mean, really, it was about encouraging people to appreciate and enjoy the landscape through understanding what's made it special and unique. And really, one of my aims from the project was to show that people are key to the natural environment. We have a lot of, these days, people kind of perhaps imagining a world where we can go back to a pristine wilderness. And I really wanted, you know, heritage to be really key in that, and to actually, for people to recognise that a lot of the particular sort of ecological interest that we have within the valley is as a result of human land management practices and our sort of rich cultural history as part of the valley. So the history and the culture created by the interactions are woven into the fabric of the landscape that we see today. And the project area's unique landscape character reflects thousands of years of interaction between people and the environment. And the landscape has actually been defined by these interactions. So historically, the basis for the seasonal rhythms of life, the farming year, the activities and skills required to maintain the land. And we wanted to show that understanding the past can inform current and future land management, that skills and understanding learnt from traditional farming and past land management practice are really very relevant today. And we wanted to help revive and support the use of these skills and apply traditional land management techniques more widely across the partnership sites and beyond, so benefiting the historic and the natural environment. So we did this through quite a lot of training to share information and knowledge needed to care for the valley's landscape in a genuinely sustainable way. Now the problem was we started with the project and thought, what can we choose? You know, we kind of need to focus down a little bit because there are all sorts of elements of the local landscape. And of course, we went back to the historic landscape characterisation and identified key landscape elements from that that we felt were really quite important. And also, we wanted actions that would deliver best for both natural and cultural environment. So we decided to prioritise hedgerows, meadows and parkland. And the parkland landscapes really are you know, quite, really define the Tywi Valley in this area. We've got a lot of parks and gardens. A lot of our project partners have parkland as part of their remit, and looking after that for character is really important. So we've got Bishop's Park, Parc yr Esgob down near Carmarthen. We've got bookended at the other end of the project area by Dyffryn Park and the National Trust who are working there to sort of manage their parkland. And in the middle we've got Gelliair, so Golden Grove, and the National Botanic Garden of Wales, the Middleton Parkland. And so all of those things came together to mean that we selected these three areas, even though we were a bit like children in a sweet shop, basically. We could have done quite a lot of other things, but we decided to focus on these three key areas. So fundamentally, in the Tywi Valley, many of our settlements are built alongside the river and often at the location of historically important crossing points. So the frequency of extreme weather events associated with our changing climate is of real concern. Now, hedgerows and meadows are both excellent for carbon sequestration. So that's taking the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Hedges and meadows also help to slow down rainwater runoff from the land, and their reinstatement and maintenance could play an active role in helping control flooding for the future. Now, the Tywi is always flooded. I mean, there's no change there. It's got a very active floodplain, and that's evidenced by the river's shifting channels and changing course. To the farmers of fertile low-lying valley floor, living with regular inundations of floodwater was second nature. And an important element of local land management was keeping stock off at-risk areas during long spells of wet weather and then returning the herds and floods to pastures which were really made lush by the rich sediment deposited by the mighty Tywi River. And one of the reasons that historically the valley has got so many sort of castles and stately homes, it's really quite a fertile area. It's a rich landscape, and a lot of that is due to the fact that there's, you know, it's been fought over because it's such a rich landscape. It's got a beautiful sort of southwest facing aspect to the landscape, which means we funnel sort of warm air up the valley, which means that the growing season is a little bit longer. We've got a proper microclimate in the Tywi Valley, which is really nice, except for if you've got children who like snow, because we've been regularly sort of looking out and hoping that we'll see snow recently, and sadly we're a little bit low and it's fallen everywhere else bar on the Tywi Valley, but it just goes to prove my point. So I'm going to look a little bit more at some of the areas that we worked with, starting with hedgerows. So a really good example of how intertwined the natural and cultural environment actually are. Hedges, a lot of people sort of imagine hedges are natural. They're part of the natural environment, and with this big drive to sort of connect up the landscape with hedgerows. The hedgerows of the Tywi Valley and other areas are absolutely full of history and skill. So they're created by local hands to a style based on a set of principles specific to the area, using tools made locally and some to a very particular local pattern. There's actually a Llandilo billhook, which is quite exciting, and they're famous for being really particularly useful ones. I'm hoping actually I've got a picture of one somewhere. There we go. Yes, this is the efforts of our project hedge layer, who's a local hedge layer, and that's his favourite billhook, just put him for scale on some nice Carmarthenshire style hedge laying, and that's along the side of Gelliar, which we did as part of the project. So before post and wire fencing was available, it was absolutely essential that hedgerows were well constructed and well maintained for managing stock. And I think that the reason that a lot of them have sort of blackthorn and hawthorn in them is because they're quite quick growing plants, and they become stock proof very, very quickly because they're so spiky, and so they tend to keep stock where it should be. We've kind of lost this skill set over the last 100 years, and sadly it's dying out. I think it's a real shame that people don't realise that not only by the regular sort of cutting back of hedges and not laying them properly, we're not only doing damage to wildlife, but we're also doing damage to a sort of a tradition that's survived and has developed over hundreds, if not thousands of years. So this stock-proof enclosure goes back a very, very long time. I particularly like that slide because the one on the right is what seems to be some hedge laying in the dark going on, but actually I think it was winter time. We don't do hedge laying during nesting season, and that's just kind of got a bit late at night, but it's just to show how determined our hedge layer was to get the job done because he'd been taking a training course during the daytime. So we ran quite a lot of training for hedge laying as part of the project. So so most of the training for hedge laying was December 2020 and November 2021. And again, we were curtailed by sort of restrictions because of the pandemic and people having to work opposite each other when nobody really knew, whether we even outside was acceptable. So we did quite a bit of training and safely socially distanced managed to lay a hedge, which actually that's another one that's at Gelliar, and it's very beautifully laid, and that one is Carmarthen style as well. We also instigated the first ever Tywi Valley hedge laying match, which was absolutely fantastic. It was a really wonderful day, and a lot of the older hedge layers, the generation that can remember laying hedges, and they're sort of champion hedge layers, and they came out. I mean, particularly the offer of a tractor parade really sort of helped to get people out of the woodwork, I think. So and a free bun at lunchtime. So we had lots of links, and we had prize giving at the end of it. And these hedge laying competitions used to be a really regular feature of sort of rural life. Sadly, those are dying out as well. And interestingly, Dyffryn has never actually had its own one, which is strange because there is actually a specific Carmarthenshire style for hedge laying. So we've started one, and we're hoping we'll be able to we'll be able to do another one as well. But some initial success. Oh, let me just go back a second. So I started off thinking about sort of landscape features, landscape feature top trumps possibly. So I went through and thought about hedgerows, meadows and parklands. And for hedgerows, I've got noted down historic landscape character, my score is out of 10. Historic landscape character 10, biodiversity 10, carbon sequestration 8. It's possibly not quite as good as a large woodland, but certainly in areas where, you know, you've got agriculture in the landscape, this is a really good way of ensuring that, you know, we've got hedgerow standard trees. In an agricultural landscape, hedgerows are absolutely brilliant for carbon sequestration, and it's a key element of the historic farming landscape. And I think, you know, essentially, they're essential for connectivity. They're vitally important in supporting our local wildlife populations, and in terms of sustainability and environmental credentials. You know, they're absolutely. You know, we should be keeping this tradition alive of learning how to lay a hedge properly. So that's what we did as part of the training for the project, and the hedge laying contest. So we also carried out a few surveys and a bit of research. We did a species-rich hedgerow survey in the Tywi Valley, and we also did a Dyffryn Tywi brown hair streak butterfly survey with a local ecologist. So moving on to meadows. So until recently, an absolutely vital component of the farming landscape in the Tywi Valley throughout Wales and the UK. They provided summer pasture grazing and hay to feed livestock over the winter months. The UK decline in meadow areas is about 97% of wildflower-rich meadows lost in the last 100 years, and that's kind of headline news at the moment. But what we really need to understand is that these are artefacts of human management of the landscape. Some of the tall herb flora, which is typical of meadows, is thought to be the tall herb flora which was typical of forest clearings just after the last ice age, and the recognition that probably it was human action that kept these clearings open and created conditions that were suitable for this flora to survive. And the fact that meadow management is a key skill, and that happens regularly, sort of once a year. But you take your hay cut, crucially, after the flowering plants have had a chance to flower. And that was how these meadows were managed. And really, we've lost this environment very recently to the proliferation of sort of extremely, the monoculture kind of ryegrass and the silage cuts. And so in terms of, you know, our sort of top trump scoring, I think probably historic landscape character is currently low, but it should actually be a 9 or a 10. It's a key but now largely absent component of the Tywi Valley's historic landscape, and particularly on the flat floodplain of the valley bottom. I think meadows were a key feature of this landscape, and sadly we don't have very many left, but there are now people restoring meadows. And as part of the project, we did various things. Oh, that's a really nice photo which I dropped in at the last minute. So that's haymaking in Friars Park in Carmarthen in 1910. So not only are meadows sort of key for biodiversity and part of our historic landscape, but they're also a crucial part of that sort of farming calendar and a sociable occasion, and something that, again, you know, this is 1910, it's just over 100 years ago. We've lost this in the blink of an eye in terms of sort of human evolution, and it's hardly any time at all, and it's very sad that we've lost that sort of community kind of gathering together, and also the fact that it was so amazing for our biodiversity and the ecology of the landscape. Let me just take on to the next. So one of the project actions, or several of the project actions, was spreading Winelast National Nature Reserve green hay wildflower seed and happiness across the project area. Um, so basically, we at the National Botanic Garden of Wales, we have a brush harvester now for our seed collection to pick up seed, and we're able to then distribute that to other areas, and also a very much quicker process, which involves a hay cut, and then you have to get it very, very quickly, because spreading green hay in other areas is all about timing. As soon as it dries and starts to decompose, it's not much good. So you have to take the hay cut, and then you have to take it out. So we also did a good round of spreading green hay in other areas, such as at the Bishop's Park and up to Dynever. We did a bit of meadows training. So a very traditional way of managing meadows is by scything. And although I'm not advocating the sort of back-breaking work of scything, you can see a few people trying some scything down the bottom there. I mean, it's a long and laborious process, and you can absolutely see why people came home from the fields absolutely exhausted. But there's an early 20th century reference to the music of scythes, and it's basically somebody bemoaning the loss of the music of scythes, which is this very regular rhythmic swaying from the fields local to where he lived and grew up. And so, again, a sort of sad loss to kind of traditional land management practices, and something which is very much better for wildlife, a much slower process. We also did some conservation training. That one's at Getliau, but we ran some at Dynever as well, and went out and discussed about stock management. And there's very specific stocking levels which are appropriate for different forms of habitat and types of grazing. So it's all quite complicated, and as Ken said, that would take a whole nother presentation in itself. So I think we did quite a lot of other project activity that really supported our meadow management. So we did a survey of surviving species-rich grasslands within the project area. That was by a local ecologist, Rob Parry, and that was a research on the location of these surviving grasslands. And actually, one of my ambitions going forward would be to get perhaps some voluntary input to look at tithe maps and look at the incidence of labels like Dall and Gwine, because these are referring to meadows and potential meadow management. And one of our volunteers at the Gardens has actually done a little bit of research into that so far, and it's looking fairly promising that you can identify where the locations of these meadows actually are. So it would be really nice to do a sort of comparative study as to where they've survived and where they are, and how prevalent they are, because it seems that, you look at most tithe maps and apportionments, and actually Dall is quite a regular name. You can get a lot from the place names, and I think that's another bit of study which would be really nice to link this back in. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm going to have to go quite quickly through. Okay, so yes. Quickly moving forward. So that was our Meadows Past, Present and Future Day at Dynever. That's partners collaborating on meadow management in the project area. A little bit about Parkland. This is where it all started. Caring for the Parkland during the Regency Restoration project. There's some tree planting going on there. I've spent quite a lot of time explaining to people that in Parkland landscapes, sublime tufts, or parkland clumps as we call them, are just as appropriate in terms of connecting up the landscape for biodiversity as hedgerows are, because obviously we're wanting to retain that landscape character, but actually parkland clumps are really useful for that as well. So that was the Regency Restoration project. Practical parkland actions at network partner sites. So we did ash dieback clearance, planting alder and willow whips, cleft chestnut tree guards, management of veteran trees, and wildflower and hay spread. So we also trained 2 apprentices in Lantra Level 3 in environmental conservation. So that's Oshan and Dan, who became part of our very small team, and they worked with estates teams across network partner sites. That's Oshan's Meadow project, so wildflower seed test beds, and meadow seed collection from Wine La Senenar and spread in partnership with the National Trust, and the interpretation was written bilingually by Oshan. We also picked up on other traditional skill sets which really do need to be maintained. I do normally wax lyrical about buildings and their traditional buildings and their environmental credentials, but I won't because I haven't got time. But that's our apprentices doing some training up at the Tywi Centre. We installed some cleft chestnut fencing in Castle Woods, another traditional skill set. So we ran an orchard management course, or several, and some woodland management courses. And the reason we got very distracted by orchards is because I was really aware that within the project boundary, although we're not generally thought of as an orchardy area, actually these are historic orchards, or at least the ones that are recorded. And a lot of those, I'm aware, came from first edition Ordnance Survey maps, and you can see little pockets of land with neatly arranged trees on them, and that's usually very close to a farmstead. And so actually these are all our orchards, or relict orchards and historic orchards in the Tywi Valley, which is way more than people generally tend to assume. We also did some training on much more modern skill sets. We created a website, which at the moment is being a bit refreshed, so it's down at the moment, but it will be up and running again soon. We created some meadow wildflower identification guide, and we were very keen to do some natural resources for health and well-being because it was one of our project remits. We were going to work with the local health service and create a wellbeing garden, but as we entered the pandemic, it became quickly clear that they weren't going to have the capacity to do that at the time. So we went for trying to encourage people out into the landscape by positioning benches for people to sit on and rest. So I just wanted to say right at the end, before I finish, there are a few bits that are really important to sort of remember from this, and some conclusions. So there would have been opportunities to work with the local community to sort of capture memories, traditions and language associated with farming practices that have changed, record people's connection with the landscape that's being lost. But again, unfortunately, the pandemic got in the way of that. You know, a lot of the people who we would have liked to speak to were very elderly at the time, and often in sort of care homes and things like that. And so we had to give up on that idea, even though it was a bit of an ambition. And it's something that I'd really like to do in the future, because these people are being, you know, they're not going to be there forever, and we need to get these recollections, because it's about the specifics of landscape. And I think what we've tried to show through the Dyffryn Tywi project is that although we're living in an era when the environment and climate change is finally and thankfully at the top of almost everyone's agenda, and this has changed dramatically since the late 80s, early 90s, when I was in school and setting up an Earth Action group, and that believing in climate change at that point was kind of considered tantamount to believing in the tooth fairy. But since then, things have changed and everybody's talking about it. But what we tend to do is write people out of the equation. And I still hear people dismissing heritage and local history and landscape history and archaeology as a nice to have and not a need to have. But it's the careful and meticulous observation and recording of the past that we know and love as part of archaeology, and discovering and highlighting the unique and individual, locally specific components of a landscape and the human past in a local context. And what we're finding has huge value. You know, we can talk about smart solutions to issues caused by climate change, and these are making the headlines. And those that are achievable at a local level have the potential to be the most effective. And also talking about nature-based solutions as well. So these make much more sense when they respond to specific local conditions, and we've got a test bed of hundreds, if not thousands of years. So the low-tech solutions, the practical approaches to everyday issues, some which were almost certainly invented in the Tywi Valley, are crucial to the current environmental agenda. And I think in a valley where dairying has always played a prominent role in the economy, and even back as far as the early medieval period when we got wealth on the hoof, and you know, back beyond that, rather than just planting trees, which is the most common prescription for global temperature rises and controlling flooding, looking after our hedgerows well, re-establishing meadows, and that might be much more achievable and a much better fit with our local landscape. And so how humans have lived with the land in the past, so our past interaction with land and landscape, particularly at the specific local level, is absolutely crucial to devising ways that we can do a better job of living within our means environmentally for the future. So that's thank you to our funders and to our brilliant project team, and to all our network partners and the practitioners of traditional skills whose skill sets we utilised during the project. And just to say at the end, next time someone asks you to justify your existence as an archaeologist, it does happen to me occasionally, you can say you're saving the planet one trench or hedgerow or traditional building or meadow at a time. Thank you very much.